Hello, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Bree Hogue and I'm the sales manager at Powell City of Books here in Portland, Oregon. You can check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Over the next week, we welcome authors Stephanie Scott, Steve Olson, Daniel Kraus, Molly Weisenberg, and Bonnie Sui. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in the coming days. We're so happy to welcome Justin Taylor in conversation with Tracy O'Neill. Justin Taylor is the author of the story collections, Everything Here is the Best Thing Ever, and Flings, and the novel, The Gospel of Anarchy. His other work has been in The New Yorker, Harper's, and the Sewanee Review, among other publications. He's a fiction editor at the Literary Review and lives here in Portland, Oregon. When Justin Taylor was 30, his father, Larry, drove to the top of an airport parking garage to take his own life. Thanks to the intervention of family members, he was not successful, but the incident would forever transform how Justin thinks of his father and how he thinks of himself as a son. Riding with the Ghost is Justin's new book, and it seeks to answer the questions of how and why family members fail each other. Tonight, Justin is joined in conversation by Tracy O'Neill. Tracy is the author of the new novel Quotients, as well as the novel The Hopeful. Her writing has appeared in Granta, Rolling Stones, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, LitHub, and many other publications. This evening's event will include a conversation between Justin and Tracy, followed by a Q&A. If you have a question to ask of either author tonight, please submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can support Justin and Powell's by purchasing a copy of Riding with the Ghost. A link to the book has been shared in our chat this evening. Please join me in welcoming Justin and Tracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bree. And thank you, Tracy, for being here with me. And thank you to everyone out there in the audience. I'm just going to read for a few minutes from the book, and then Tracy and I will talk. As Bree said, the book is about a lot of things. It's a book about my father. It's a book about our relationship. It's about his death. It's about being a teacher. About a lot of stuff. But I'm going to read a section from the title chapter that's a little bit off center from some of that stuff that I just mentioned. In this section, I am living in Indianapolis as a visiting writer at Butler University, and thinking about taking shooting lessons. So this is I'm just going to read you about a gun for a little bit. I don't know why. And then we'll talk. Oh, here's the book. I failed to set this up so you could see it, but so you can see it now. Anyway. Every time I drove to the Kroger out on Keystone Avenue, past an ugly strip of vape stores and fast food joints, I noticed a billboard for the Indy Arms Company, a gun shop and shooting range. The winter was bleak, the cold gray days bleeding together. Dad was a mess, physically weak, an emotional wreck, his anti-shaking medication increasingly unreliable in its efficacy. On dragged the weeks and then months after the inauguration. Oh, I should have said this is this is the spring of 2017. On social media and cable news, people were working themselves into fits about how Trump was about to resign in disgrace and flee to Russia, or the deep state was going to sabotage the will of the people by undermining him. Or maybe they were going to save us from the autocratic coup he was planning, or maybe had already carried out. I was halfway through my time in Indianapolis as Butler's writer in residence. I was looking forward to getting back to Portland, but I knew that I would find myself in the same situation I'd been in before I left. Lonely, unemployed, adrift in both my daily life and my larger sense of myself as a writer. One of my self-imposed goals for Indianapolis was to finish the novel that I'd started in 2014 and had been in an on-off relationship with ever since. Now there were no more excuses. I had the time, the space, the job title. All that was left was for me to do the work. But the work wasn't working, and the deeper I dug into the project, the more certain I became that it never would. The book wasn't good, it wasn't going to get better, and I didn't want to spend any more of my life in its claustrophobic, half-baked world. There was some relief, even liberation, in admitting this to myself, but that small comfort was far outmatched by a feeling of loss. For my wasted time and energy, for the hopes I'd harbored for the novel, the usual fortune, acclaim, etc. My job title felt fraudulent, my career like it was over. And there was that sign on the road again, the huge Crosshairs logo, and me with my little tote bag full of chicken breast and organic bell peppers, taking a long look as I drove past. Other than 22s at summer camp, the only time I'd ever fired guns was during college, at an anarcho-communist pecan farm outside of Gainesville, Florida, during the Christmas break of my freshman year. I spent 2 weeks out there helping plant 1,000 pine saplings in one of their fields. The plan was to grow the pines, harvest the timber, and use the money to pay off the mortgage and thus ensure the farm to anarcho-communism for all time. I loved these people and was eager to live in their dream, if only for the break between semesters. On New Year's Day 2001, we shot up stacks of old TVs that they'd been saving for the occasion. I remember a revolver and a shotgun loaded with what somebody called pumpkin balls. I remember the level and aim and the indrawn breath and the trigger pull, how it takes more force than you think it would. 8 pounds, they say, which isn't much for an arm, but is something for an index finger. And the faces of those TVs as they sagged and spidered. The power that you felt knowing that you had flung that damage across the distance, the stacks wobbling and eventually toppling over. And the way that we talked, calm and casual, about how after the revolution came, these were the kinds of skills we were going to want to have. Was all that really 16 years ago and longer? And now, perhaps, a revolution had come, only not the one we'd banked on. Indiana has long been a hotbed for white supremacy, and there was a lot of fear in the air, on the internet, on the news, in nervous chit-chat, that violence might break out at any time. Also, my in-laws are gun owners, responsible ones, it should be said. They both grew up in the Deep South and have concealed carry permits. Once, I was out on my father-in-law's boat, just me and him, and he asked me to get him something from the glove box because he was steering. In reaching for it, I passed my hand over a pistol, which in my innocence I thought must be a flare gun. And when I said something to that effect, he let out a short laugh and gave me a look I hope to never again see on his face so long as I am married to his daughter. I had thought at various times about asking him to take me shooting. I thought we might both enjoy that. But I had never asked, in part because I hadn't wanted to admit that if we did go, he would have to teach me how to shoot. Could it go without saying that we were out on his boat that day because he was patiently teaching me to fish? Here then was another factor in my abiding interest in the Indie Arms Company. At the same time, I knew I was doing this at least in part to be able to tell the story of having done it. The story I could tell my dad, or whoever else. The story of that time I went and shot guns in Indiana. But I didn't tell anyone. Why not? Because I couldn't explain what I was drawn by. Because I wanted to live alone with the idea a bit longer. Because I knew Dad would try to give me advice, teach me over the phone everything he knew or thought he knew about marksmanship, all of which would be based on 40-year-old knowledge, itself gleaned from a different kind of gun entirely. An ancient rifle from a stint on his high school shooting team, an episode he'd never mentioned until the day I found the weapon, still in its original case, with 2 boxes of bullets, amid his stuff in his Nashville storage unit. Against my better judgment, I'd shipped it to him with everything else, and so it sat now in his bedroom closet at the Sunrise Lakes apartment. I did not want to get him talking about that gun. I went to the range on March 22nd at 10 a.m. for their introduction to handguns class, which got me the instruction I needed, a gun to use, range time, and a dozen bullets, all for one tidy package price. It turned out that I was the only person who'd signed up for the session, and so the class became a private lesson. The instructor was a local kid, 25 or 26, an Afghan war vet, honorably discharged after an injury that may or may not have been suffered on the field of battle, but was in any case not visible. Something about his back, I think he said. I thought about the experiential and psychic gulf between what he was doing at 23 and what I was doing at that same age, between his life and mine. I marched against the wars he fought in back when he was still too young to fight in them. We had tried to stop them before they started, but the wars came anyway, and they never ended. So he came of age and went to fight, and they were still being fought without him now as he sat in a windowless classroom tucked between the storefront and the firing range, teaching an erstwhile Jew from Miami the right way to hold and load a Sig Sauer P226, the standard issue infantry sidearm, same as he had carried in the desert. It wasn't a real Sig Sauer I was holding. Not yet. This was a dummy gun. He was teaching me how to load a clip and work the safety, the correct overlay of fingers and the two-handed grip. He taught me a breathing exercise that I recognized from yoga. I did not tell him this. When he deemed me ready for the real gun, we went out to the range. He had warned me about the kickback on the SIG, which is an automatic pistol, but I didn't understand what he was saying until I squeezed off the first round. The gun bucked like a mule, and I found myself pointing its lightly smoking barrel at the ceiling. The spent shell, having spit itself back at me, bounced off my glasses and fallen into the collar of my shirt. My teacher took all this in stride. Slowly, I got steadier, less skittish. I put some holes in the orange silhouette on the target. I asked if I could switch to another gun. He said the AR-15 was a lot of fun, but I didn't want to spend that much money on bullets. So I asked for a .357 Magnum, the only other gun I knew the name of, which was heavier than the SIG, but for that reason, easier to hold steady. Without the automatic's fierce recoil to reckon with, I did a better job of maintaining my aim. A half dozen holes appeared in the target, and sure, they were low and to the right, hardly kill shots, but there they were within a couple of inches of each other, clustered like a constellation in the belly of the silhouette. The whole experience lasted 2 hours and cost me $100. I remember I thought that I should tip him, but I'm not sure if I did, or if I did, whether he accepted. I knew that I would not be returning to this place. My purpose in coming here had been to attach experience, something known and felt, to the otherwise largely abstract concept of a gun. Abstract to me, I mean. Now I knew something specific and untranslatable, the weight and heat of metal, the river of silence that ran between the click of the Magnum's hammer pulling back and the thunder of its falling forward. As he rang me up at the front register, my teacher suggested I consider getting a range membership. I told him I was in town for work. I couldn't bring myself to say the word semester, much less writer in residence, and that I only had a month to go before I left. Well, heck, he said, if you're only here a little bit, one thing you've got to do is see the Tiger Sanctuary. The Tiger Sanctuary, I said. The Tiger Sanctuary, he said, out in Center Point. An old man, a grizzled type, the kind of guy with whom I had expected to spend a morning such as this one, emerged from the back room of the shop. Y'all talking about the Tiger Sanctuary? He said. Yeah, I said. You been out there too? Best $10 you will spend in this life, he said. And it's not just tigers, neither. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was great. I really liked hearing you read it. Well, this is just such an absolute treat. We met teaching, which, that's a big part of this book. But I had already read some of your short fiction when we met, and this was the first book of yours that I got to read having known you. And I so enjoyed it. I just swallowed it whole in one day. It was like the way I spent a Saturday, and I loved that, getting to spend this time with your mind. So thank you for this book, and thank you for letting us do this, have this chat, this hang. So I thought that I would start out asking you about a particular part of the book. It comes very early, and you sort of frame the project for your reader. And as I think was mentioned earlier, the book covers about 10 years, although there's some background given about your childhood and your father's life. But you write, this book then is an attempt to tell the story of those 10 years, but also to deconstruct it. What were the stories my father told himself, and do I believe them? What are the stories I told myself about him or about us, and why did I, and do I still, believe those? If my father, as he often said during what turned out to be the last years of his life, was a failure, when and why did this failure occur? Did he fail all of us, or only himself? In what ways did I fail him? How did it come to that night on the roof of the airport parking garage? And what was the path back out? Who was Larry Taylor? It took me longer than it should have to realize that this last question was another way of asking, who am I? And so I wanted to repose two of those questions to you now, not only having finished writing the book, but having a little bit of distance from it. So I wanted to know, why is a parent knowing oneself, and what does it tell us about our destinies?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really big questions. And I don't know if I still have definitive answers to them. I mean, I guess the book itself is a kind of answer, but I don't think it's a final or comprehensive one by any means. And I guess a big part of this project for me, honestly, was figuring out how much I wasn't going to figure out. That, you know, the book has a focus, and I hope a structure, and certainly an agenda, I guess. You know, it sort of develops one as it goes along as you're writing it. But it also has a limit. You know, it's about 200 pages. As you said, it's focused primarily on this 10-year period, and then within that, focused really on these 2 years, 2017 and 18, you know, before my father died, and then the first year after he was gone. And everything else is sort of crowding around at the edges. Sometimes, you know, jostling for space and not getting it, sometimes kind of fighting its way in, and other times totally neglected. I mean, just left out. You know, it's not a biographical, there's biographical elements, but it's not a biography, you know, of him or of me, for that matter. But so I guess to try and answer your question, which ironically, this was my question, the more that I tried to write about my father and answer questions that I had about his life, the more that I found myself needing to turn the lens on myself, and to think about my own choices. And I think when it started, my idea was, you know, kind of similar to a fiction writer. I mean, you're trying to imagine a character and get inside their head, and you say, well, what is important to this person? And, you know, what was their attention on? And this is true, I think, to some degree of all parents, but in Larry's case, it was true to an enormous degree. His children were a main focus of his life, particularly as he got deeper into depression and felt like his own life was not going the way that he wanted it to. And, you know, and his career and his ego took different kinds of hits. It was a very different kind of attention and a different magnitude of attention that he was paying to me and my sister. And I think, you know, probably all, I mean, I'm not a parent. I imagine all parents feel that way about their children. But I think there was a certain kind of path of this. And so I realized that it was kind of impossible to think about him, or certainly to think about his and my relationship, without trying to imagine some version of how he saw me. And what, you know, if you're thinking about a relationship, like, you know, you got to be able to look at it from both sides, right? And if you had asked him, I think he would have given a very emphatic and probably, you know, partisan answer to that question. And folk, you know, he's proud of his children and he loves them and they did this and that. But to really write about him and our relationship, I had to really think about like what he probably wouldn't have said, certainly did not say to me, may or may not have said to other people, which is that, you know, we were two adults in our relationship eventually, and our relationship was complicated, and I was annoyed with him sometimes. Sometimes he was really annoyed with me. You know, we fought a lot. We did not always believe the other person was doing the right thing. You know, particularly in that section that I read tonight. I mean, I think in a later chapter, I come back to Gainesville and talk a little bit more about you know, the anarchy adjacent years, you know, which I later kind of wrote a novel about. That was something that really upset him a lot for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different ways. Not even the politics in themselves, although he didn't like those either, but the way that they manifested, you know, in daily life. And I think when you're 20 or 21, you register that, like, dad is mad at me, dad wishes I would cut my hair, whatever. But to really write this, I had to think much more deeply about like how scared and angry he would have been that, like, I might have dropped out of college and I might have wanted to go hop freight trains and join the circus. I didn't do any of that shit, but like I was really thinking about it. And so, you mentioned the word destiny before. Like, this is a guy who was born to working class parents, put himself through college, had always dreamed of a kind of upper middle class ideal and being able to provide in certain ways. And it really ate him up that he wasn't able to do that, but he was kind of faking his way through it. I mean, I didn't work really in college. I had a couple of jobs, but, basically, like, I kind of lived like a wealthier person than I was because I had a state scholarship and was willing to actually just live like shit. So I think he was, yeah. This is kind of trailing off, so I'm gonna cut myself off here. But do you see what I'm saying? This,
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I am curious what your circus act would have been.
It would have been just this, in the worst circus act.
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, one of the contexts that you think about this relationship between you and your dad and is faith, and you sort of talk about why he might have been so adamant about you doing the bar mitzvah, right? But there's one part that there's like this one page that I really love, and I wanted to just read it all, but then, I realized that I was just going to be reading your entire book back to you, so that would be embarrassing. So I'll just read a little bit, but you write, the Maggid of Mesrich chooses theft and heartbreak as his metaphors, then finds in them the locus of God's love. And you go on to write about the idea of God's wildness, to write, the only answer to life is more life, and the only answer to a story is another story, which in a way I think you sort of rehearsed in your last answer, right? But I wanted to know how these ideas about God's wildness and about locating God's love through theft and heartbreak operated as important themes or metaphors for you to sort of unravel this narrative.
Yeah, and thank you for asking that. Actually, it's, that whole kind of part of the book is maybe the tertiary plot line, but it is actually really an important part of it for me. And it was something I fought really hard to keep in, especially when we were in edits, because I was not communicating it in a way that anyone else could understand why it was even there. And my very patient editor worked with me at great length to like make me connect it to the rest of what was going on and kind of make sure it was just, earning its space. And that question makes me feel like it actually got there, which is really great to hear. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain why one is drawn to religion or spirituality or ideas of faith, conceptions of faith. I think it's, it's either drilled into you by the culture you're raised in, which was really not the case with me, or it comes from within somewhere and, you don't really know what it is at first, and then you have to find a language to express it. And one of the things that I write about in here is that for me, a lot of that language actually became Christianity before it became Judaism, because even though I was raised Jewish, I was raised a very secular, Jewish, culturally Jewish, I guess you'd say, although I did have a bar mitzvah and, like a lot of American Jews, like a lot of Jews, period, I guess. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between the cultural aspect of ritual and what would otherwise be the affirmative content of the actual prayers and rituals that you're doing. And again, sort of everyone to decide for themselves, like whether you get one or both, you know, or if it's different things at different times. But American Christianity, because it's so pervasive and frankly, because it's in English, is what I connected with first. And a lot of that comes back, and I don't mean like, mainline, like evangelical, whatever. I mean a kind of politicized, like very left-wing Christianity, which is just what I happen to encounter, which is one of the reasons why it's so bound up with anarchism, I think, in my mind. The idea of theology as a kind of liberation, as a kind of leveling of boundaries, the opposite of, I think what a lot of people think of religion as doing or being for. And it took me a long time to figure out that Judaism has its own versions of that also, because I just never been exposed to them. And I would say even in that passage you quoted, like that idea of a kind of supreme wildness or unknown. I mean, the closest analog to that, frankly, is probably like Joy Williams or, John of the Cross or something. And at least, as far as I know, and as far as my sort of literary approach to theology, you get some of it in Harold Bloom, Bloom, the good Bloom, not the bad racist Bloom, but like the old good Bloom of like the Jewish Gnosticism and like the kind of interesting 80s books, gets really invested in certain ideas of the Old Testament, where the way he conceives it, like what we call eternity or the divine, is a kind of eruption within time. Like it's not a sequel to life. It's not like you go to heaven wearing your skin suit and like just sit there forever. But there's a kind of like, I don't know what he's quoting when he says this, but he uses this phrase a lot in one of the books, more life into time without boundaries. So that there's a kind of, it's a sort of upwelling of vitality that overflows its bounds and has this kind of eternal or timeless component to it, but it's being experienced in real life. That's an experience of transcendence or divinity or whatever. And so that wonderful book of Martin Buber's The Folktales of the Qasidium, which is like his anthology that he edited of all this old Jewish folklore. I mean, the kind of stuff they just don't tell you about in Hebrew school. These absolutely amazing, baffling riddles and fables and koans and legends and like, that's the kind of crazy, wild stuff that the early Orthodox had. It's Eastern European folk tradition, a lot of it. I mean, with the Jewish bent, and I just love that book and that one little fable of the Maggid of Mezrich, the parable of the strong thief, which is the epigraph to that chapter. I don't know. It's just like something I'm a little obsessed with, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I was excited to see you dive in. And the only Martin Buber that I had read before was I and Thou, and it's the only one I had really heard that I'd ever gotten to like have a conversation with anybody about. So when I saw that allusion, I was pretty psyched. So there's a part in the book where you're talking about your father's illness, and in a way, this is like, like the diagnostician moment. It's like the Dr. House moment, right? Like we're going to figure out what has killed this man in a way, right? And so you write, and when I say this illness, do I mean Parkinson's or depression? Do I mean poverty, capitalism, America? He's being killed by the healthcare system at least as much as bad choices or bad genes. What name will I give his death if he gets one of his dizzy spells and falls down in the shower or on a flight of stairs? And so, I was really interested in this moment and the way in which you pose these sort of urgent biopolitical questions. And when I was reading your book, I was thinking about how we often talk about political novels, right? And we don't often talk about political memoirs. And so I was wondering if, when you were writing this book, if there were any books in your mind that might sort of fit that description or that you felt you were in conversation with in some fashion. I thought of one actually that you couldn't have been reading then, I don't think, but The Undying by Anne Boyer, I feel asks sort of some similar questions at certain points. But for you, when you were writing this, were there any?
I mean, the honest answer is probably no, because I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. I mean, I think this book does have a politics, and particularly around the questions of healthcare and just support for poor people, for people who are in need, for people who are out of work or can't work. And there is a very real chance, frankly, that if we lived in a civilized country with a social safety net and a healthcare system, my father would still be alive. Because even though he made certain choices and decisions and things that happened in his life, the amount of suffering really at every stage, particularly after he became long-term ill, was completely gratuitous and unnecessary. And although, if he had Parkinson's, and I don't know if that could have ever been cured, but the kinds of treatment that he could have sought, the mitigation of his symptoms that could have been undertaken, or even just having more ready access to the mental health and social services that he almost certainly needed, would have changed a lot of things, not just over the last 10 years of his life, but probably over his entire life. I mean, it's sort of, at a certain point you have to decide what the scale of your imagined alternate reality is, so I think what I would say when I started the book, I was much more angry at him personally, and the deeper I dug into his story, the more I saw him as, I don't want to say a victim, but as someone reacting to a very constrained set of circumstances at almost every stage of his life and doing what he thought was right or possible. And that doesn't mean it always was right, and it doesn't mean, sometimes he was mistaken in his sense of what was possible, and there were things that he could have done or could have let other people do and he didn't. But none of that changes the basic fact that if you were able to access basic and specialized medicine, at any stage of our lives, any of us, we would all be doing better. That's just true. So, if he'd been Norwegian or Swedish, it would probably be a very different book, or it might not exist at all, because whatever. But to this question of memoir, I mean, I guess for me, it was so unexpected for me to write a memoir in the first place that for a long time I didn't want to admit I was doing it, and I kept trying to pass these chapters off as essays. And I was like, I'm just writing a book of essays, anyone can do that. And I finally had to admit that wasn't true. The chapters are pretty, I think, tangled. I feel like the book is a pretty dense knot that's hard to separate out. And it's a personal story, and it just is. And so once I admitted that, I looked to other memoirs by people who were primarily fiction writers, because I thought that might be a good model, which is not to say anything negative about memoirists. I mean, I think, people spend their entire lives writing autobiography and memoir and personal nonfiction and personal essay, and it's brilliant work. But for me, I thought, assuming this is my only time riding this ride, who are the other fiction writers who've done similar things? And so Donald Antrim's memoir of his mother, The Afterlife, is an amazing book. Jonathan Franzen's The Discomfort Zone, I actually think is a really fantastic memoir, and arguably one of the best books he's written. James Allen McPherson's memoir Crab Cakes, which is an incredibly strange but deeply beguiling book. William Styron's Darkness Visible, which I think is the only one of the ones I'm mentioning that's actually quoted in my book, because I was reading it at that time. And also just one more I'll mention briefly. My old undergrad teacher, Jill Cement, is a really interesting novelist and story writer. She wrote a memoir called Half a Life that was about her adolescence and running away from home and coming back from home. And I haven't read that book in a very long time, but I read it when I was her student. And I think just having that memory in my mind that someone who does this could also do that was really helpful. And she's actually, I think, writing a sequel to it now. I don't know when it's coming out. There was a piece of it in Harper's, like maybe it'll come out next year. And I think it's called The Other Half. And I think the project is like 20 or 30 years out from writing this memoir. Do I still believe myself? Yeah. And I find that to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, that's a cool rejoinder.
Yeah.
Also, I believe there's another memoir that's called Half a Life by Darren Strauss, which begins, half my life ago, I killed a girl. Or I don't remember if it's killed a girl or killed someone. I think it's killed someone. But anyway, cool. That's interesting. Well, you know, I'm glad that you brought up the sort of naughtiness of the book, because I did want to ask you about the structure, which is quite elliptical. You layer temporalities, you layer textualities. Quite early in the narrative, you mention a set of notes that you started taking about your father, which sort of then begin to appear in some form in the book. And so there's a sort of mechanism there where writing opens up time and allows you to do some interesting structural work. So one example would be of a place where that happens is where one of those sort of elbows is. I call them elbows, I don't know why. You write, earlier I wrote, I grieve 2 years for my father, and when it is over, I lay his ghost to rest, release myself. This sentence is both true and not true. When I wrote it, I did not yet know what grief was, or not completely. I still don't. Maybe never will. Maybe nobody does. Mourning is, among other things, a form of preservation. And so, in a sense, it is never over and never should be. And I think that that is really an idea that you enact through the form itself. But I'm wondering if you had anything to say about sort of what these formal gestures opened up for you, or how you arrived at them, or what the challenges are of making these sort of metatextual moves.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, as far as like the overall structure, the very first chapter was written first several years before I wrote any of the rest of it. And it was just something that I had to get out. And I think when it eventually became the sort of thesis statement of the book, like it presents the problem that the rest of the book tries to solve. And then the two chapters that are called literally Notebook, the Indianapolis Notebook and the Hattiesburg Notebook, I mean, that it's because that's exactly how they were written and where they were written. And they were much looser and messier and more sprawling than they appear here. But I did want to try and preserve some of that original associative quality and that ability to move between different timelines, because that's how memory works, and that's how that kind of memory writing works. This makes you think of that, makes you think of that, which connects to this, which makes you realize you were wrong about this other thing. And so I think because those were some of the first sections that got written, it ended up just making sense in a certain way, to have different devices in different chapters. And it may also be too that some of the formal stuff like allowed me to go where I was trying to go, because as I said before, I think I was initially skeptical or perhaps just scared of the idea of memoir itself. And so giving something a formal and structural framework, you know, a little bit like writing formal poetry, it's like, okay, well, whatever else I'm doing, I know it has to do this. And that creates a freedom within those boundaries that you set. But with regard to the one you're talking about, that late chapter that you quoted from, the 2 trips to Sunrise, that was another case where it just kind of happened that way. I took these 2 trips down to Sunrise where my father lived in the spring of 2017, one about a month before he died and the next about a month after. And by the time I sat down to write about those, I knew what I was doing and I knew what this project was. And I didn't know that I would write those 2 things together, but I just couldn't write them separately. it was like I just kept writing them side by side, and like in my mind it was almost like 2 columns, although I thankfully never attempted to actually do that. Um, but I think like having made that decision, for better or worse, that these 2 trips would be unfolding simultaneously, like it just generated this idea of fact checking myself in a certain way. And so I started pulling these quotes from much earlier in the book. I was like, well, this is what I said about grief while my father was still alive. Like, is it still true now that he's actually gone? Something was a metaphor and now it's literal. Like, does the proposition hold up? And that was just a really interesting question to me, both formally and I guess psychically, you know, like I was really genuinely curious. And I think sometimes I was right and sometimes I was really wrong. And I guess the last thing I would say about it is that is also where the book kind of took its inward turn. Like the story has to end somewhere. And for me, an ending is usually a kind of inward turning, like the work has gone as far as it's going to go and it's going to turn back on itself and complete the circuit or find some kind of completion or something. And once you get to the chapter where like the timelines are converging and you're quoting yourself and drawing conclusions, like you're really about done, you know?
Like reach the asymptote of self-referentiality, and now you have to stop. Yeah.
Throwing yourself off the text triangle and yeah, straight to the conclusion. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I still have like a bunch of questions that I had wanted to ask you, but I do feel like we're also I know we're running into the audience question time a little bit right now, so I don't know if I should ask one more, if you just want to go to audience questions or.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any audience questions yet, so maybe this is a good time to remind people in the
Oh
crowd
yeah,
that if you do have questions, you can use this handy Q&A button right down here. You should see it on the bottom center of your Zoom. You can also ask them in the chat, but those will be a little harder for us to see. So if you use that Q&A button, Tracy and I will see them, and then we can start answering them. So if people want to start doing that, we would greatly appreciate it. But Tracy, maybe if you have another question.
Oh, I have like another 5 questions. Those are just the ones that I narrowed it down to for this ahead of time. But yes, please do ask some questions. I was supposed to bring that up, I believe. So Justin, thank you for dealing with my irresponsibility. Let's see. All right. So since we might be getting questions soon, I feel like maybe I'll just go to my question I had planned to end on. That's okay. Sure. And so once more, I'm going to quote you at length. I'm sorry. But here's a fact. My father's illness forced me to understand that the man who raised me, the man I was so angry at, whose shortcomings, misjudgments, and failures, both real and imagined, I wanted to reckon with and indict him for, no longer existed. He was replaced by a weaker man, one who would have been obliterated by the force of my anger if I had unleashed it. All this new man needed from me was love, patience, compassion, and sometimes a Target gift card. I know that I did not always rise to these occasions. Then you go on to add, but sometimes, maybe by the end, most of the time, I was able to give him what he needed. That he allowed himself to receive it was its own kind of miracle. I'd like to think that this succor and repair, this redemption, could have happened if he'd stayed healthy. But I'd be lying if I said I was sure it would have. So I was really struck when I was reading this about the idea of need and sort of what the requirements are for redemption. And so I think that there's one reading, which is getting a little Freudian here, that you did bring up Harold Bloom earlier. So I feel that that's okay because...
Okay. I'm always good with Freud.
Yeah. And of course, Bloom and the Anxiety of Influence brings up this notion of misprision. And so, since you brought him up, I feel very okay asking this. I wanted to ask, if, there's a reading here of the text in which redemption sort of requires the son to replace, reinterpret, misinterpret, that would be the Bloomian way of putting it, misinterpreting it, or even eliminating
Yeah.
the powerful father figure. And so, and in that way, coming to sort of that new paradigm of care, that redemption, or I think in this book, an identity as sort of like an artist of familial love, right? This writer who has reinscribed the meaning in this relationship. And so I wanted to sort of ask you about that in relationship to an earlier passage, right, where you talk about storytelling in the relationship with your father. So you write, I enjoy the attention, the laser-focused love-hot attention. I can never tell him enough about myself, and I am the hero of every story that I tell. I come to both crave and resent this dynamic, which I view as unchangeable, though it is of my own invention. And I'm wondering if you feel that that storytelling dynamic, now having written this book, has somehow been shifted, and where you see that desire to storytell to your father, and in this case, storytell or tell the story of your father to the father. Where does that desire go now, or where is it? Is it permanent? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, he was a great talker. He was a great talker, and he was a great listener. And so that storytelling, instinct, he had it, I have it, and so at a certain level, I think it's just very natural. I mean, you can even see it from the way that I start answering these questions and then just never stop talking. But the kinds of stories that you have to tell, not only to other people, but the stories you tell yourself, I think, change over time. And this, and it's very easy to become locked in to a certain kind of story. And whatever else you can say of my father, and there's a lot of people here. I'm looking at the attendees. There are a lot of people here who knew him, and if they could open their own video screens, which they can't, they would back me up on this. He was a force of nature, and to be the subject of his attention could be a very good or a very bad experience, depending what you had done to provoke that attention. If he was helping you solve a problem and feeling like very validated by your need of his aid, he could be the most helpful and supportive person you will ever meet in this world. And if you pissed him off, or he thought you were making a mistake, or you just disagreed about something, he could be really loud and ugly. And it was just sort of assumed that if he was like, he took it about as well as he gave it, I would say, at least on the surface. And so if he was screaming, it was not obvious to him why you weren't also screaming, because he grew up in a house where people screamed at each other, and that's how they communicated, and you just screamed until you were done screaming, and then you moved on with your life. But most people don't respond in that way. They get hurt or scared or just annoyed, and that was never really clear to him, like how to avoid falling into that, how to communicate with someone like in the way they need to be communicated with, as opposed to like in your default mode of communicating. And so for, his and my life, we had plenty of epic fights as epic conversations, kind of flip sides of the same coin in a certain way. But in those passages you quoted, and one of the things that I really had to figure out in the last years of his life was that he just wasn't capable of that anymore. He was sick, he was tired, he was coming from a different place emotionally and physically. And when you spent 30 or 33 years of your life with someone who's always going to be the loudest person in the room, and you learn how to be the next loudest person in the room if you hope to be heard by them, that's a very specific kind of dynamic. And if the other person stops, then you're the loudest person in the room, and you're the one screaming and going wild at someone who's really not capable of or interested in meeting you where you are. And that was something that I had to figure out, and figure out what that meant. you know, and yeah, I mean, some of it is like, there is like a thematic or sort of deeper interpretation like you're talking about, but a lot of it was actually really practical. It was like, you're on the phone with a person who's 3,000 miles away that you're trying to get to do something to take care of himself so that you can like sleep better at night, and just realizing like, okay, 5 years ago, like we could have screamed this out and then moved on. Like, that's not going to work now. Like, I have to do something else or this isn't going to happen.
Yeah, you have to sort of start telling stories in a new genre.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think we got some questions now.
Yeah, we got a bunch.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did you want to choose or do you want me to choose?
You choose.
Okay. Let's see. So how about this one? Why were you reluctant to call it a memoir and what was your hesitation?
That's a good question, Nora. I think part of my reluctance initially was I just didn't really know if that's what it was. I didn't know if this was material I was going to put out in the world in any form, or if there would be enough of it to justify doing. I remember the first time I talked to my agent about it and said, you know, maybe like one day if I have like an essay collection, like it'd probably mostly like book reviews and shit that nobody wants, but like I have these other essays about my dad, like 2 or 3 of them, maybe that could kind of be in there too and like give it more of a shape. And he was sort of, yeah, you know, who knows, you know, write them if you got them. And then and then eventually as I kept going with this, as I said before, these aren't essays, this is all one thing, etc. And so just realizing what that meant. And I think for me, and I wouldn't say this is true for everybody, like certainly the James Allen McPherson memoir is one example of a very formally experimental memoir that is personal but not confessional. It doesn't give a lot away. It asks a lot of you. And I really admire those things about it. But for me, part of getting this book to a place where it was finished and ready to go out in the world meant thinking about the term memoir and the genre of memoir and the idea of a certain kind of open-handedness or consideration of audience that frankly I don't bother myself with in my fiction, which may or may not be to my fiction's credit, but it's just true. The fiction gets written the way that I want it to be written, and if it finds an audience, that's great, but there's really not a concern while I'm composing. But this was really written with a reader in mind, and an audience in mind. And so a lot of the decisions, especially places where I was going to pull back on the more experimental or dense or withholding parts, you know, I kept coming back to this idea that if you're going to make this foray into the genre, you should embrace it on its own terms and try to do something that honors it, you know, that errs on the side of inclusion and openness in a way that I wouldn't ask a short story to do, because I only expect 8 people to read it anyway.
Yeah, I did feel like when I was reading this, having read your other work, that on the level of the sentence, right, it was very different stylistically, right? It was sort of like a more laconic voice. And I mean, it offered interpretations actually, which fiction rarely does, except for sort of a more like essayistic form that, or sort of a form of fiction that like nods to the essay, right, which is still pretty rare. Okay, great. Well, that's terrific. I mean, you know, I think that maybe you have touched on this, Justin, but if there's anyone you want to add, authors who influenced you. So you mentioned the McPherson, the Styron, the Antrim, Branson. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll mention 2 more really quickly. Both short story writers, actually. The two guiding lights of this memoir were Lori Moore and Sam Lipsyte in a certain way. Lori Moore's People Like That Are the Only People Here. When I decided that I was really going to try and do this, I took the last 2 lines of that short story, you know, there are the notes, where is the money? And I made that the epigraph to the book. It was the first thing I saw in the Word document every day for years. Because I just, again, thought, like, if you're doing it, let's try and do it. And for a long time, I fantasized that I would be able to keep that as the actual epigraph in the finished version, and eventually admitted to myself that that was maybe a joke that was funny in my office and not funny in the rest of the world, although I'm telling it now. So anyway, I deleted it from the manuscript, but I printed it out and pasted it to the wall above my desk where it's actually still sitting. So
You wrote that Laurie Moore essay too.
Huh?
You wrote that piece on Laurie Moore this past year too.
Yeah, and then I got to write about her collected stories, which was such a pleasure. I mean, she's just such a great stylist and thinker, and a great example of someone who is often at her funniest when she's at her saddest, which I think was instructive for me also, which also brings me to Lipsite. This story from the fun parts that I just love and have taught about a million times, called Nate's Pain Is Now, which is a satire of what I call the memoir industrial complex. And I just reread that story all the time and thought, this is whatever else you're doing and however far you want to lean into this, like, this is when you've leaned too far and have fallen into the well, and don't do that. Don't be this guy. If you've never read that story, you should. I love that story. So yeah, so those are two more that I would mention.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. It's sort of like you wanted to stay in the inoculation bubble during the pandemic, right? You want to stay in the like good memoir zone. Don't get out there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, terrific. So one part, and actually, I should say, this is a question that comes from Justin's wife, Amanda, who runs a wonderful literary festival in Portland, Portland Literary Arts. And I'm going to say, well, okay, I'm going to ask the question that she says, but I'm also going to bring something else up. So she asked, throughout the book, you're very clear about what you don't remember. You acknowledge the gaps in the memoir as part of its structure. Was this an intentional act or a more subconscious pattern in the writing? Oh, wait, no, that's from Jen.
Amanda is asking on behalf of our other friend, Jen Kovitz.
Oh, okay, I see. So, but I'm going to actually say about this, a cool thing about, one thing that happens in the memoir several times is that when Justin makes these submissions, oh yeah, share, show and tell. Yeah.
I can't see them. They're in the yard. They just got back from a socially distanced hike, and I think they didn't want to interrupt, so there's drinking beer in the front yard. Anyway, you were saying.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds great. But a lot of times when Justin does sort of admit these gaps or not being quite sure about certain things, he references Amanda, and he'll say like, I remember it this way, but Amanda tells me that it happened this other way. And so anyway, back to Jen's question, not Amanda's question. Was this an intentional act or a more subconscious pattern in the writing?
Yeah, it's a great question. At first, it was unintentional. I was actually getting things wrong, and when not Amanda, but not only Amanda, also my mother, my sister, you know, talking to other people, like as I was drafting some of this stuff, I really did have to confront the fact that I was mistaken about certain things, or other people had different memories of how things had happened, or, you know, whatever. And so at first it was really unintentional. At a certain point, it became intentional only in that when I realized where those gaps and fissures were, sometimes I wanted to correct the record and figure out what had really happened and nail it down. And sometimes I thought it was actually instructive, perhaps in a Freudian way, to look at where those memories collided, why I had been wrong about certain things, or where the multiplicity of perspective was maybe more interesting than coming to a consensus reality. So there were certainly cases where I tried to really foreground those points of confusion or lapse, or lacunae, once I realized that they were there. And I think there's probably even a couple cases where I probably could have filled in a gap and just chose not to. And there were other cases where I put a lot of work into like journalist style, figuring out, you know, particularly in the biographical stuff about my father's early life and my parents.
I love that chapter, the second chapter, yeah.
I did, that was probably the closest I came to doing like semi-formal interviews, mostly with my mother, but also with a couple other people, and just being like, so they moved here when, and this was where, and, you know, this theme park opened, and like, Dad saw this concert in 1971. So there were times when it was really important, but other times when I didn't think it was.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. I was thinking about that while reading it too, as somebody who's primarily a fiction writer as you are, that you're sort of using different sort of practices, different epistemological practices to do information gathering as opposed to sort of like, you know, scrupulously thinking about what could be true, right? So I think that this is a question that might be really interesting if there are any potential memoir writers in the audience or people who write creative nonfiction. So Joshi asked, or Joshi said, "This is so poignant, thank you, Justin. Were you ever concerned about how this work would be received by other family members? Was self-censorship ever a concern?"
Yeah, it was. I mean, I was worried how people would take it. My father was a very private person, and so I never would have written, well, this, first of all, but really anything about him while he was alive, because whatever else was going on in our relationship, I respected that, and I knew how he felt about that. And so, in a way, one of the biggest questions that I faced after he was gone and after I realized that this is what I was writing was whether I would try and publish it at all. And I eventually decided that I would. And I was very lucky, I think. You know, the people whose reactions I was most concerned about were, you know, my mother, my sister, my wife, and they all read early drafts and, you know, had comments and edits and opinions, but were really supportive, not only of the project as I was writing it, but of my kind of right to do it in a way that I wanted to. And I felt really grateful to have that support. I don't know that I was entitled to expect it. And maybe I just got lucky because I was working on a book that they liked. And maybe it was a kind of deeper thing than that. I don't know. But I was not trying to write a book that would upset people or, you know, betray confidences, I guess. So yeah, I actually did not feel like I was self-censoring in any serious way. But I would also say I don't think that that's the worst thing in the world. You know, if this had been a different kind of memoir and I was like really out to, I don't know what, you know, I think there are times when you don't censor yourself and you burn the bridges you have to burn and you do the work that needs to be done and you just do it. And as personal as this book is, I don't think of it as a bridge burner. Although I don't know, you know, I guess there are some bridges out there, people I haven't heard from, you know, the bridges could be on fire and I just forget it. You get the
Yeah, those bridges are already gone. You're gonna have to like hop the wagon and then float across.
Float the
like
river.
got another way to get to the Oregon Trail. Yeah, I feel you on that. Okay, so this is a question from Peter. How do you feel the isolation of visit? And I'm glad he asked this because we didn't get to talk about teaching earlier. How do you feel the isolation of visiting professor work influenced the book and your relationship with your father during those final years? How do you feel this book would have been different if you were in NYC or Portland throughout the decade in question? And I think that, you know, one of the things that's interesting about this question is that we had talked a little bit about class earlier, especially in relationship with healthcare, but I do think that part of the narrative of this book as well has to do with like the economics of being a writer, the like abysmal economics of being a writer and taking gigs all over the country.
Proletarianization of higher ed. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the answer to the question right there. You know, when we lived in New York, I was adjuncting full time, teaching 3 or 4 classes a semester and doing okay because I was teaching at pretty good schools and so the students were amazing. Some of them are actually here tonight. And the money was all right. So it was not the same kind of adjunct grind that a lot of other people I know were going through where they're teaching 6 and 7 comp classes, you know. I was teaching creative writing to amazing, talented students at Pratt, at Columbia, at NYU, and it was privileged relative to a lot of other things, but still quite precarious. I mean, you just had to go around every semester and every school year, and are you taking me back? You know, da, da. But we were making it work, and that's an economy of scale because New York had enough schools to support that, and I had connections at those places that they kept asking me back. And when we moved to Portland, I lost all those things because there's only 3 or 4 schools here and only 1 or 2 of them that ever need adjuncts, and it just, the economy of scale didn't work here. And so I was really broke and unemployed for a couple of years, which was pretty brutal. You know, I wasn't, you know, I hadn't sold a book. I wasn't doing, you know, so there was no money coming in from that. And so that's how I ended up doing these visiting writer things. And in a way it was, they were trading up. I mean, they're prestigious positions, you know, you're grateful to have them. And again, in relative terms, I mean, an enormous privilege to be a visiting writer at the Butler MFA program at the University of Southern Mississippi, you know, et cetera. And I loved being in those places, but it really did mean, particularly the way that this worked out, I did Butler and Indianapolis, Butler and Mississippi back to back. And so it was basically a year and a half, almost 2 full years of living by myself in these temporary arrangements. And I had barely gotten used to living in Portland. So it was very isolating. It was very disorienting. And yeah, and so in a way, and I talk about this in the book a bit, it actually helped me understand my father a little bit better because he had spent a few years, particularly after the divorce, living this kind of weird suspended animation existence because he kind of refused to move on, and he was living at this extended stay motel, and a lot of things that he had talked to me about that I didn't understand, I experienced some version of. I mean, not the full extent of what he went through / chose to go through, but you know, live by yourself in a weird little room in a city where you don't know anyone, and there's a lot of hours in the week, particularly when you're supposed to be spending them writing a book you're not writing. You know, and you have colleagues who are wonderful and welcoming, but they also have families and kids, and you have grad students who are awesome and, you know, you can spend time with, but you can go out for drinks with the grad students twice a week. You shouldn't do it 3 times. You can't do it 4 times. So there's just, you know, it's just, yeah, it's a lot of time to fill. And I think that it helped me connect with him in a very improbable way, and also shaped the writing of this book, particularly the year I spent in Mississippi, because that was the first 9 months after he died, and I was just out there, and I'd inherited his car, so I was just driving his car around, you know, thinking about him, and that's really where the title and a lot of the book came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and the writing too, like you also have a part of the book where you talk about how you liked having talks with your dad in the car as well. That was the time you'd often call him. So I think that the final question actually comes from Amanda. And so Amanda was asking what we've been reading recently. And so I recently have been reading, I guess, what might be considered a sort of formally experimental memoir in some way, or at least nonfiction, creative nonfiction that's adjacent to the personal narrative, Jane, a Murder by Maggie Nelson, which is not a new book, but is one that I have not gotten a chance to read yet. And what about you, Justin?
I just read True Love by Sarah Gerard, which I thought was a great novel, just came out. I read Q by Catherine Lacey, also brand new, absolutely fascinating and strange book, like all of Catherine's work. That was another, you just sort of dive into it and you're like, okay, you know, here we go. So those are both great. And oh, we were talking about this before we started. I was telling Bree from Powell's that I just today had a great customer experience with Powell's. I did a curbside pickup from the Hawthorne store. I got the complete stories of James Purdy and Brad Watson's Aliens in the Prime of Their Lives, both of which I'm really looking forward to diving into. And then the very last one I'll mention, there's a short story collection called Sleepovers by Ashley Bryant Phillips that's just out from Hub City Press, and I am waiting for my copy to arrive. She was in conversation with our old colleague Wiley Cash earlier this week, and I watched that event and was really impressed by it. And so I'm super excited to check that out whenever it shows up, if we still have a postal service next week.
We don't really know what we're gonna have next week, do we?
We don't.
That was so lovely. Thank you, Justin. And I think that we now are seeing that it's time. We're getting the hook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. Thank you everyone for being here. It was great to see your names, if not your faces. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to both Tracy and Justin for joining us this evening. You can purchase a copy of their books, Writing with the Ghost and Quotients, at powells.com. We put the links in, thank you. We put the links in the chat function right now, so you can click on that real quick. And you can keep up with us at powells.com, see all of our exciting lineups coming up, and place your own order for curbside pickup. Again, it has been a fantastic night, and we're really appreciative of you all for joining us. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you guys so much. See you later.
Bye.